The finale of The Boys was perfect, and I say that because the show was always mediocre, especially on the writing side, and this ending was the only logical conclusion for a story that honestly never knew where it was going. Let's be honest here. The Boys started with a concept that at the time seemed genius. Superheroes as massive corporations, villains with marketing departments, a necessary cynicism in a market completely saturated by the Marvel formula. It was something new, gritty, and fun. But after the second season, we all saw what happened, right? The show became an infinite loop. Every new arc, Butcher would try to kill Homelander, fail, someone close would die, Homelander would become more unstable, and we'd end up right back at square one. The show became a hostage to its own formula. It needed Homelander to remain the ultimate threat to exist, so the script sabotaged any real progress to maintain the status quo. That's why the finale is perfect. It finally accepted its own mediocrity. It didn't try to sell itself as a masterpiece. It didn't reach for an epic conclusion that would change the course of television. It delivered what the show had been delivering since the first episode. A mix of gratuitous violence, shallow subversion that looks like it was written by an angry teenager, and a nihilism that deep down said absolutely nothing new about society. You can feel the writer's laziness in so many moments. Characters who were once fundamental simply lost their purpose. Plots that seemed like they would be game changers ended up fizzling out, and the political satire, which should have been the high point, became an exercise in reciting newspaper headlines without any creative filter. Homelander, who started as an almost divine threat with that psychological fear Anthony Starr carried on his back, was deconstructed until he became almost cartoonish, losing all the nuance that made him a memorable villain. And you know what? That's fine. The writing was never the strong point. The show always leaned on shock value, gore, and that look how subversive we are attitude. When you strip that away and try to analyze the text, the structure, the real evolution of the arcs, what's left? Almost nothing. The finale being perfect is precisely because it didn't try to fix 4 years of mistakes in 2 episodes. It embraced the chaos, it embraced the lack of direction, and in a way, it was honest with the viewer. Many fans expected the show to have a conclusion that would make all the time invested worth it, but those who followed the series with a more critical eye realized it had been dragging its feet for a long time. The ending was a dry, direct, and honestly, deserved period at the end of the sentence. Maybe the biggest mistake people made was expecting something profound from a product that always preferred a punch to the gut over character development. For a long time, the show was a guilty pleasure. We knew the script had holes the size of an aircraft carrier, we knew the motivations changed according to the convenience of the next episode, but we stayed for the cast's performance and the brutal aesthetic. In the end, The Boys ends as a perfect metaphor for the current entertainment market. Loud, visually aggressive, but hollow on the inside. If the finale was satisfying, it's because it finally stopped promising that it would be something it never was. They didn't try to raise the bar, they didn't try to be a work of art, they were themselves until the last minute. And considering the history of stumbles, being faithful to its own mediocrity was the smartest decision they made. Let's get into the details, because this is where the circus catches fire. The show always had this chronic problem with scale. You look at the first few seasons and Homelander was an untouchable god. The script had to create bizarre situations to justify why he didn't just exterminate everyone in 5 seconds. As time went on, that tension was lost. They started weakening the villain to make the script work, instead of raising the level of the protagonists. It's the old Dragon Ball flaw, where you need to invent a new power every week because the previous one doesn't make sense anymore. It's pathetic, actually. And this mediocrity of the script is reflected in the way they treated the boys as a group. Were they incompetent by design? Was it a narrative choice to show that they could barely tie their shoelaces while facing superpowered entities? Sometimes it felt like the show wanted to be a comedy of errors. Sometimes it wanted to be a serious political thriller. It never made up its mind. The result is this patchwork quilt where the tone is never consistent. The writer didn't know if they wanted to make you laugh or leave you outraged, so they threw both into a blender and served this tasteless paste. Some people say the show is a portrait of the modern world. I think it's a portrait of how modern writing deals with public attention. It's all done for the shock of the moment, for the clip that will blow up on Twitter or TikTok, without thinking about whether it makes sense within the season's arc. The perfect finale in this case is one that manages to end this cycle of noise for the sake of noise without trying to be too pretentious. It's an assisted suicide of the narrative itself. Butcher, for example, a character who spent the entire show with a clear motivation. How much did they have to stretch that so they wouldn't lose the contract? How much boring subplot did we have to swallow just to get to the scene of someone important dying? It's exhausting. When you look back, you realize that half of what you watched was pure filler. But again, we kept watching. The problem isn't just with the show, it's our expectation in wanting fast food entertainment to have the complexity of a gourmet dish. And that's where the perfect finale comes in. It doesn't try to convince you that you've seen something profound, it delivers the conclusion of the chaos it created itself. If the show was messy, why would the finale be organized? Why would we have a conclusion that ties up all the loose ends if for years the writers let those loose ends fly in the wind? It's a matter of coherence with the failure. Many argue that the show lost its way with satire. Before, you had to interpret what was critical and what was just absurd. Today, the show chews everything for you, as if the viewer were incapable of understanding any nuance. Subtlety was sacrificed on the altar of political relevance, and that is a clear symptom of a script that doesn't trust its own story. The finale was perfect because it stopped trying to preach to us and simply closed the books. Think about it. If the script were good, we wouldn't be having this discussion. We would be debating the characters' motivations or the world building. But what we discuss is how much the show's quality has fallen. And that is exactly where the finale fits in. It doesn't try to deceive us anymore. It doesn't pretend to be what it isn't. You know that moment when you realize a relationship has no future? The finale of The Boys is exactly that. It's a breakup where both sides are already tired. There's no more fighting, no more drama, just the urge to move on. And that, curiously, is liberating. It's fascinating to notice how the audience defends certain script choices as if they were bold. Boldness is doing something that challenges. The Boys did what was expected, the same old thing just with a bigger budget. True boldness would have been having a defined arc from the beginning, without having to resort to these cliches. But let's be honest, demanding that would be asking too much of those who were worried about how to make the next episode have more blood than the last. I see many people praising the ending as if it were a creative triumph. Maybe it's a triumph of survival. They survived 4 seasons of a script that got lost. They survived the need to please a fandom that swallows anything. And they managed to close the door without letting the whole building fall down. Is it mediocre? Yes. Is it a C grade? Maybe less. But considering the abyss they created, getting out of it intact is already an achievement. We also have to talk about the relationship between Butcher and Homelander. They were two sides of the same coin. We heard that 800 times. But the script never explored that with any depth. It was always superficial, always an exchange of threatening looks and catchphrases. The finale could have delved into the psyche of this toxic dependency, but it preferred to keep things at the usual level. And ironically, that's why it's a perfect finale. They didn't try to be brilliant in their last breath. They continued to be what they always were, consistent in their own superficiality. Look, if you want a lesson in screenwriting, don't look at The Boys. Look at what the show provoked. It served to show that nowadays, a strong concept is worth much more than a well-executed one. If you have cool visuals, a charismatic cast, and a topic that generates controversy, you can hold an audience for years, even if the story goes nowhere. And the finale, by being mediocre, just confirmed this cruel rule of streaming. The problem with The Boys isn't that it was bad in the beginning. It was promising, it had the spark, but it was suffocated by its own need to be bigger than the script allowed. Characters like Starlight, who had a hero's journey arc, were reduced to mere supporting players in a conflict that no longer felt personal, just administrative. The loss of focus was total. And let's talk about Huey, the character who suffered most at the hands of the writers. He started as our eyes in the story, the normal guy. By the end, he was just a punching bag who lost his identity every season. Why did the script insist on keeping him as the eternal apprentice when he had already gone through enough horrors to turn into a psychopath or a criminal mastermind? No, they kept him in the same place because it was comfortable, it was safe, and safety, my friends, is the death of creativity. Every finale they delivered felt like a meeting of executives deciding how not to annoy the shareholders. Kill this one, keep that one, leave a hook for the spin-off, done, deliver. There was no soul, there was no touch of an auteur that you see in shows that really care about their conclusion. What there was a service, uninspired manual labor. You can tell the difference between when a writer loves what they write and when they are just punching the clock. In The Boys, in recent years, it seems the clock was huge and the desire was zero. The action scenes, which should have been the culmination of the story, felt rehearsed and devoid of any real danger. We knew no one important would die, or if they did, they would be brought back or replaced in 2 episodes. Predictability became the trademark. And the politics? Oh, the politics. The show treated complex themes with the subtlety of a sledgehammer to the face. It's not that I don't agree with the criticisms the show tried to make, it's that the execution was so primary that it ended up serving only to polarize social media even further, which, ironically, gave the show exactly what it wanted: empty engagement. I wish I had the experience of seeing The Boys as something truly remarkable, something I would remember 10 years from now. But when I think of it, I only remember the exhaustion of watching a story that promised much and delivered the basics. The finale, being mediocre, is just the cherry on top of a cake that should never have been made that way. And for those who still insist that the finale was perfect, that it had layers, that it had subtext, well, I wish I had that optimism. The truth is that the show was made for an audience that is satisfied with little, and it fulfilled that role with mastery. If the goal was to end a mediocre show in a mediocre way, congratulations, they succeeded. The final grade for this outcome is just a reflection of how detached we already were emotionally from this whole mess. Can we talk about Black Noir? Another character who had his potential thrown in the trash. The mystery around him, the reveal, everything seemed like it was going to lead to a fascinating place. And what we got? A lazy, cheap solution that ignored everything that was built before. It's the perfect example of how the show treated its own lore. If it's not convenient today, we ignore it. Continuity didn't matter, immediate impact was everything. And Queen Maeve? She had one of the few moments of redemption that, in a way, actually worked, but even with her, you could see the script was operating on autopilot. Oh, she has to leave, so let's create this conflict here. It wasn't organic. Nothing in this show was organic after the first season. It was all mechanical, calculated, insipid. When a show reaches its end, we expect to feel something. Sadness at the departure, euphoria at the conclusion, reflection on the theme. With The Boys, what I felt was just a pew, a finally over. And if a work of art, or whatever this is, leaves you feeling relieved that you don't have to watch it anymore, it failed in almost all its missions. The mediocrity of the finale was ironically the greatest act of honesty they had. They freed us from the obligation to keep following this shipwreck. Therefore, when I say the finale was perfect, it's not a compliment. It's a diagnosis. It's the recognition that for a show that lost its way so early, there was no glorious exit. There was only the possible exit, and they took it. Now, the real question that remains isn't about Homelander or Butcher. It's about us. Why do we still let ourselves be seduced by this flashy packaging? Why do we spend hours discussing a script that clearly didn't have half that effort put into its writing? It's a reflection we need to take to the next big release. Don't get carried away by the hype. Hype is the new marketing, and marketing is the new script. Now is the moment to ask, did you really think you would have a finale that lived up to the expectations, or were you just happy that it was finally over? Comment below. No sugarcoating, because the script for this show, let's be honest, was a disaster announced a long time ago. While you're at it, subscribe, because if you like seeing the truth told about these overrated productions, this is your place.